All right, I'll be speaking today a little bit about the key solar radiation modification approaches and their potential implications for the Sustainable Development Goals and the pursuit and hopeful implementation of these goals. Some of this work goes back to a study that I was a part of a couple of years ago and that we're currently updating. This study was done in a collaboration with C2G and Perspectives Climate Research, as well as the Research Network Climate Strategies and the IASS. So this is by no means only my own work, but really the effort of a large group. So we'll look at how SRM differs from greenhouse gas mitigation, what the different approaches are for solar radiation modification, and what their common working principle is. We'll have a look at what the Sustainable Development Goals are and how SRM might actually interact with the pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goals. So there are only a handful of approaches really that are currently being considered in academia, in research, and in some governance discussions. The first one is the most often discussed, is the injection of aerosols in the upper layers of the atmosphere, so in the stratosphere, which is basically twice as high as where commercial aircrafts are flying. The second one is a change in the way in which clouds are letting energy through. So high clouds, the cirrus clouds, let some amount of warmth through. And if we change that, so the idea, one could basically alter how much energy is retained in the atmosphere. The third one is above the oceans, a lot lower, where the idea goes that you could have a fleet of ships of some kind which basically create or brighten already existing clouds and basically reflect sunlight that would otherwise come down onto the ocean surface. And then there's another group of ideas which are to cover land surfaces with brighter materials, whether it's by planting different types of crops which are brighter, or whether it's by actually laying out certain materials. There's also ideas of covering glaciers to maintain their whiteness and thus prevent them from heating up. So there's a whole host of ideas, but this is not a very concrete approach yet. And all of these really only exist as concepts, as ideas in research, essentially. So this is to summarize, all these different approaches have the same principle. They reflect or they change how much energy comes in or is retained in the Earth's atmosphere, but they occur at different altitudes, essentially. And as we all know, color or reflectivity affects the temperature. So what could solar radiation modification achieve, or what could it not achieve? Because there is very clear limitations that we have to ascribe to this idea, this abstract idea. So it's very clear, and science is very clear on this, mitigation of greenhouse gases is the absolute priority. SRM cannot replace neither the rapid and deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, nor the removal of CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. So it's very clear SRM does not replace in any way the efforts that we're already putting into mitigating climate change the way we do. However, as we're currently not seeing anywhere sufficient efforts to really eliminate the emissions of greenhouse gases globally, and we would need to get those emissions to zero as quickly as possible. There is a growing risk of impacts from climate change, and essentially the higher up we get on this graph into the yellow territory, the graver these risks are. And we'd essentially need to get to zero, as indicated by these stars here, as soon as possible, and we're not on track for doing that. So here we can see, basically, in a simplified way, the historical emissions of greenhouse gases and how greenhouse gases are accumulating in the atmosphere. And then a projection into the future, where we had the Paris Agreement reiterating essentially the goal of limiting warming to well below 2 degrees, or if possible to 1.5 degrees, as any warming beyond that threshold in a way represents really a dangerous level of warming, dangerous climate change. And we know we are not on track. We are about to overshoot this level. And essentially what SRM could potentially do, if it works as intended, is to limit the warming level at this threshold where we expect that impacts would not be as severe as if they went beyond that level. Alternatively, SRM could potentially be used to slow the speed of change, which in and of itself would probably reduce a lot of the risks, a lot of the impacts. But clearly, such a drastic intervention would come with a whole host of problems. And there's already a lot of evidence for some of these problems scattered around in scientific work in different disciplines. And on the other hand, we know we have a vision for society, which is captured in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which the United Nations adopted in 2015. But we don't yet really have a clear understanding how these potential outcomes that we know of from different scientific work, how they actually fit this picture of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is what we try to clarify a little bit in this study a while back. And we came up with a number of possible effects and also knowledge gaps, as well as risks that are already starting to become evident in the research that is being done for these different types of SRM. And SRM would most strongly interact certainly with climate action, so with the Sustainable Development Goal 13, but also directly and indirectly with all of the other SDGs. There are already quite clear indications of such effects. And I'm going to give you just 2 examples on SDG 1 and on SDG 17. These are quite different types of SDGs. It's clear that poorer populations, generally speaking, are not heard as they should be in processes of global deliberation and decision-making. And so there's a fear also that they would be disproportionately affected by any of the outcomes, whether they are positive or negative. And this is certainly something that needs more attention, the participation and ensuring that we have a clear understanding of these effects. In the best case scenario, SRM could maintain conditions in ways that really avoid some of the biggest threats of climate change to the most vulnerable, but other outcomes are also possible. And also on an institutional level, it's not clear how the actual implementation of solar radiation modification would affect public spending dedicated to the objective of eradicating poverty. And this certainly requires further attention as well. And there's important implications in knowing that the outcomes of solar radiation modification would be different in different regions. So regional differences could really challenge trust and collaboration between international institutions and between countries. And really, SRM represents a quite novel type of a coordination challenge, really requiring strong global cooperation, which could have an advantage in actually fostering such collaboration. But of course, it all depends on the level of trust that can be built and maintained between different partners on the global scale. And so it's also clear that we need to see much more effort in going into deliberation and strengthened partnerships, such that really various perspectives, various disciplines, various parts of society all across the planet get a say in these processes. And so we need novel ways to strengthen inclusivity, which again can be an opportunity to pursue such efforts, but also a challenge, as these are very complex issues. So here are some publications to point you to if you're interested in this subject, if you want to learn more. Some of the work that I've been involved in, and like I said, we're currently working on an update of this assessment, how the SDGs could be affected. So stay tuned on this, and thank you for your attention.